Have you ever paused to consider how the foundational idea, those philosophical blueprints laid down centuries ago, are just dusty historical artifacts? They're actually, well, they're actively shaping the very air we breathe today. They influence everything from our really impassioned political debates to the personal freedoms we maybe take for granted sometimes.
It's not abstract at all.
No, exactly. It's alive, it's vibrating, like every discussion about justice, every election, every right we choose to exercise.
Yeah.
So today on the Deep Dives, we're going on a journey to really truly understand the profound political theory of the American founding. And this isn't just, a simple history lesson. It's more an exploration of the core ideas that didn't just birth a nation,
Right.
but continue to define its struggles, its aspirations, and really its very identity.
And our guide, our sort of compass for this deep dive, is a really insightful and comprehensive source.
Yeah.
Reclaiming our ideals, the importance of foundational principles in today's society. And our mission, yours and mine and everyone listening, is to extract the most crucial nuggets of knowledge, the key insights from this detailed text. We want to offer you a kind of shortcut, really, to being well-informed on this pivotal topic.
Yeah, cut through some of the density.
Exactly. We'll unpack the deep philosophical underpinnings. We'll trace the historical context, which is fascinating in itself. Confront some of the internal contradictions, and there definitely are some,
Oh, yeah.
that make this period so incredibly interesting, and uncover the, well, sometimes surprising contemporary implications of these founding principles for our world right now.
Okay, let's unpack this right from the start with what might just be the most revolutionary, truly seismic idea of the American founding.
Okay.
And that's the assertion that no individual is born with an inherent, God-given right to rule over another person.
It sounds simple now, maybe, but it was earth-shattering then.
Think about that for a second. For literally millennia, societies were built on monarchy, divine right, hereditary power, sometimes just brute conquest. Authority flowed top down.
Always.
Then a few, frankly, radical thinkers came along and just fundamentally shifted that whole paradigm. They argued that all legitimate governments must derive their powers solely from the consent of the governed.
And what's truly fascinating here is how deeply this seemingly simple idea is rooted in Enlightenment thought, but also how utterly disruptive it was.
Right.
You have figures like John Locke, whose ideas genuinely revolutionized political thought. He argued for these inalienable rights: life, liberty, and property.
The big three?
Exactly. He essentially said, look, these rights aren't granted by a king. They exist just because you're human.
Wow.
And then he introduced the groundbreaking concept of the social contract, the idea that individuals willingly consent to form a government, not as subjects bowing down, but as free citizens, specifically to protect these inherent rights. It was just such a radical departure from that long-held notion of a ruler graciously granting privileges to their subjects.
And then you have Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who kind of took that idea of popular sovereignty and, well, cranked it up a notch, didn't he?
He really did, emphasizing the collective will, the general will, the idea that ultimate authority, the very essence of sovereignty, truly resides with the people as a whole.
Yeah.
He just flat out rejected the notion of natural rulers or natural slaves. It was unthinkable to him.
Right.
So both Locke and Rousseau were just instrumental in challenging that age-old concept of a birthright to power, really paving the way for a completely new way of thinking about how society should be organized.
And if we connect this to the bigger historical picture, the impact is just undeniable. It's truly global.
Absolutely.
The American Revolution, with Jefferson's Declaration of Independence in 1776, explicitly stated that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed.
Right there in black and white.
Yeah. And this wasn't just like flowery rhetoric for show. It was a profound, fundamental shift away from monarchic rule towards a government that's actually accountable to its citizens.
And then, just over a decade later, you see the French Revolution, fueled by these very same Enlightenment ideals: liberty, fraternity, equality. It dramatically dismantled hereditary privilege, showcasing this kind of universal demand for consent-based governance, even if, its path was incredibly tumultuous and bloody.
Yeah, it wasn't exactly smooth sailing there. But here's where it gets really interesting for us today, I think.
Okay.
That principle that no one is born to rule over another and government legitimacy comes from the people. It's the absolute bedrock of modern democratic governance.
It really is.
We see it in action every day, in free and fair multi-party elections, in the right of citizens to choose their leaders. I mean, think about the vibrant democracies of, say, South Africa or India.
Huge populations participating.
Exactly. Millions participating in choosing their representatives. And it's also reflected in the growing popularity of participatory democracy, where citizen engagement in decision-making, beyond just casting a ballot, is becoming increasingly key.
Which naturally raises an important question when we look at, well, authoritarian regimes around the world.
Right.
Movements like the Arab Spring, for example, I think powerfully reflect this universal desire for self-determination and consent-based governance. They are a profound rejection of rule based solely on inherited power or military might or just oppressive force. People fundamentally want a say in how they're governed, even when they're facing immense repression.
But the idea of consent isn't without its challenges or, nuances, is it?
Not at all.
Our source highlights this enduring concern about the tyranny of the majority.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Which is precisely why the founders, after a lot of debate, explicitly rejected pure, unadulterated, direct democracy in favor of a constitutional republic.
They were really worried about it.
They worried deeply that a simple majority could, and probably often would, overlook or even actively suppress the fundamental rights of minority groups.
Exactly. And beyond that philosophical concern, you have real-world socioeconomic disparities that can significantly hinder meaningful political participation.
How so?
Well, if people are struggling just to survive day to day, their ability to engage in civic life, to be informed, to vote, to advocate for their interests can be severely limited.
Right. Practical barrier.
Practical barriers, absolutely. And then you have the rise of populism, which also presents a distinct challenge. Leaders might manipulate public sentiment by appealing more to, say, raw emotions and grievances rather than rational discourse, effectively undermining genuine democratic processes and the very idea of informed, thoughtful consent.
Okay, so looking ahead then, how does this principle of consent evolve with technology? Because that seems like a huge factor now.
Oh, it's massive.
On one hand, you've got social media platforms and digital tools that seem to be enhancing citizen engagement, enabling more inclusive dialogues, rapid mobilization.
For sure. Potential for good there.
But on the flip side, we have to consider the profound implications of artificial intelligence and increasingly sophisticated data-driven decision-making.
Yeah, the AI question looms large.
There's a real tangible risk, isn't there, of kind of ceding authority to automated systems without robust human oversight, which means ensuring that consent remains central, even in a world increasingly influenced by complex algorithms we don't fully understand.
That's a crucial point about technology's sort of dual impact on consent. And as we grapple with that, it really forces us to confront an even more fundamental question. Which is, what moral guardrails, what universal principles should guide our decisions when we're creating new technologies or, frankly, governing our society in general?
Okay.
And that brings us directly to our second bedrock concept, natural law and moral limits.
Natural law. Okay, break that down.
So natural law is this profound philosophical and legal theory that suggests there are inherent, universal, and unchanging moral principles. And these aren't derived from human decree like a law passed by Congress, but from nature itself and from human reason. These principles exist, the theory goes, regardless of specific societal laws.
So it's like a universal moral code almost, not something written down by a king or a legislature, but something that exists fundamentally almost like, I don't know, gravity.
That's a great analogy, actually.
You don't need a law to know that dropping something will make it fall. Natural law suggests there are moral truths just as inherent that exist whether we write them down or not.
Precisely. Thinkers like Aristotle first glimpsed it, but it was really figures like Thomas Aquinas who solidify the idea that beyond man-made laws, there's a universal moral rule book, if you will.
Right.
It's written by nature itself, discoverable through our own human reason and reflection. And from this concept flows the idea that every individual possesses certain rights and corresponding duties, all determined by this natural law. It provides a framework for understanding morality based on human nature, not just, arbitrary social constructs where government dictates.
That makes profound sense. So my freedom of speech, for example, isn't just a legal right granted by the government.
Right.
It's also tied to a kind of moral duty to consider how I use that freedom.
Exactly. Our source mentions that while freedom of speech is fundamental, things like hate speech or, say, defamatory statements, even if legally protected under some interpretations, they violate moral duties imposed by natural law because they cause significant social harm. They undermine the very fabric of a decent society.
So it's about recognizing that individuals aren't just isolated atoms. We're fundamentally part of a larger social framework.
Precisely. The exercise of one's liberty must inherently consider the implications for others. Our source uses the example of the COVID-19 pandemic, where governments mandated restrictions like mask mandates, social distancing, often invoking natural law principles like protecting the community welfare.
Right, the common good argument.
Exactly. However, the source also points out a critical tension here. While community welfare is a natural law principle, actions like, say, censorship of free speech or restricting the freedom to assemble, unless it was specifically targeting riots, as during some 2020 events where, protests were permitted while other gatherings were not, those actions actually violated other natural law principles by impinging on fundamental individual liberties.
So it's a balancing act, and a tricky one at that.
A very complex balancing act. It highlights this ongoing tension between individual rights and collective responsibility.
Okay, so if natural law exists universally, how do governments then, enforce these moral limits? What's their role?
Governments play a critical and, frankly, often difficult role. Laws and regulations are designed not just to protect individual rights, but also, crucially, to ensure these rights don't infringe on the welfare of others.
Okay.
A democratic society, for instance, ideally builds its laws on the moral standards of its citizen standards, which are, in turn, often informed by these underlying natural law principles.
Right.
The legislative process allows for that collective deliberation, ideally ensuring personal freedoms don't come at the expense of communal well-being. And then the judicial system acts as a kind of guardian of these moral limits.
How so? Give an example.
Talk about landmark cases like Brown v. Board of Education. That decision didn't just change a law. It rectified deep-seated abuses of liberty that fundamentally contravene natural moral duties by denying equality based purely on race.
Yeah, a huge moral correction.
It affirmed a higher moral standard that transcends mere legality. It said, this is fundamentally wrong, regardless of what the state laws say.
That's a powerful example of the judiciary's role. But what about modern challenges to natural law? I mean, we're living in a world of just rapid technological advancements, increasing globalization, constantly shifting cultural values. Does it still hold up?
It's definitely being tested.
Yeah.
Issues surrounding artificial intelligence, data privacy, genetic manipulation, these all raise profound ethical dilemmas that challenge traditional notions of liberty and moral duty.
Like what?
For instance, do we have a natural right to privacy in a digital age where our data is constantly being collected? Do algorithms have moral duties, or just the people who program them?
Deep questions.
The key challenge moving forward is harmonizing these technological advancements with ethical considerations that are firmly grounded in natural law. We'll need new frameworks, new ways of thinking to define moral duties in light of innovations that simply didn't exist before.
And you also mentioned individualism.
Yes, plus the rise of individualism, while celebrating personal freedom, which is good in many ways, often prioritizes personal liberty over communal welfare. This makes ongoing discourse about moral limits, fostered through robust education, public discussion, genuine civic engagement, absolutely essential. We need to keep talking about it.
So the idea of universal, unchanging moral principles still applies, but how we interpret and enforce them has to constantly evolve.
Exactly.
Which brings us to another foundational concept: natural rights and republicanism. We hear natural rights thrown around all the time, but what exactly are they, and how did they influence the American founding specifically?
Okay, so natural rights, at their core, are fundamental rights inherent to all individuals, regardless of government recognition or granting them.
Okay.
Inherent, again, John Locke is absolutely pivotal here with his concept of life, liberty, and property as inherent, not granted by government. His perspective emphasized that these rights exist prior to any government formation.
Pre-political.
Pre-political, exactly.
Yeah.
And therefore, they must be respected by any legitimate state.
And Thomas Jefferson put it so beautifully, so eloquently in the Declaration of Independence in 1776, didn't he?
He really did.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
It's poetry, but it's also powerful political philosophy.
That's the ultimate articulation of this idea, right? Where government legitimacy comes directly from protecting these rights, not from granting them in the first place.
Absolutely. And this principle directly influenced the framing of the Constitution and, crucially, the Bill of Rights. The framers sought to secure these unalienable rights while, at the same time, limiting the possibility of government overreach or tyranny, a concern deeply rooted in their direct experiences with British imperial rule.
They knew what they didn't want.
They knew exactly what they didn't want. They wanted to create a government that served the people, that protected their inherent liberties, rather than arbitrarily ruling over them.
Which naturally leads us to Republican governance. How did the founders envision this system, representation, adherence to the rule of law, as a way to protect those natural rights? Because it's not a pure democracy, as we discussed earlier.
Right. It's a crucial distinction. Republican governance, for the founders, meant a system where citizens participated indirectly through elected representatives.
Okay.
This fostered a critical layer of accountability and maybe deliberation that direct democracy might lack. This system stood in really sharp contrast to the monarchies and aristocratic systems prevalent in their time.
And James Madison in the Federalist Papers was particularly focused on this, wasn't he?
He was, particularly in Federalist Number 10, he emphasized how a well-structured republic, with its system of checks and balances and what he called an extended sphere, meaning a large republic, could safeguard against the dangers of factionalism. Factions are essentially self-interested groups, whether majorities or minorities. Madison argued a republic could prevent factions from infringing on the rights of others, especially minority rights. It promoted a political culture where, ideally, public servants would rise to their positions motivated not just by personal ambition, but by a profound commitment to protect the natural rights of all citizens.
So it's not just about electing people, but about electing people with a certain civic virtue who are dedicated to the common good over personal gain. That sounds like a pretty high bar.
It absolutely is a high bar. The founders truly believed a fertile democracy depended on active, informed citizens imbued with this civic virtue. Now, while natural rights Republican theory was absolutely central, the founders also integrated other philosophical influences.
Okay.
But, and this is key, only if they aligned with this foundational ideology.
So it was like a filter.
Exactly like a filter. Utilitarianism, for example, which focuses on the greatest good for the greatest number, had to be compatible. A utilitarian approach that fundamentally disregarded individual natural rights for broader societal benefits was explicitly rejected.
So if it trampled on an individual's life, liberty, or property, it was out, even if it might benefit the majority in some way.
Precisely. The founders maintained a deliberate focus on natural rights as the primary criterion for evaluating other philosophical influences. Similarly, classical republicanism, which emphasized civic responsibility and the common good, was integrated, but only to the extent that it served the protection of individual liberties, not to suppress them.
Okay.
Ideas from thinkers like Montesquieu, Rousseau were studied, discussed, absolutely. But any concepts that fundamentally diverged from the natural rights paradigm were either dismissed or significantly downplayed.
This brings us to a really interesting and frankly often debated point about the prominent role of Christianity at the founding.
Always a hot topic.
Our source highlights its significant place, noting that many founders figures like Washington, Jefferson, Adams believe faith actively informed their political philosophy, viewing natural rights themselves as, well, divinely granted.
Yes, and Washington notably stated that it is impossible to rightly govern the world without God and the Bible. Now, that's a pretty strong statement reflecting a widespread belief among many in that era.
Yeah.
Pastors and religious leaders, particularly during the powerful religious revival known as the Great Awakening, reinforced themes of individual dignity and moral responsibility. They powerfully connected religious beliefs with these emerging notions of liberty and rights.
So ordinary people were hearing this connection in church.
Oh, often, yes. Ordinary Americans often learned Enlightenment values and moral principles through church sermons, through community discussions, intertwining faith with civic responsibility in their daily lives. It wasn't just an elite phenomenon.
And you can arguably see this in the founding documents themselves, can't you?
You can point to specific examples.
The Declaration's invocation of a creator who endows individuals with rights. The Constitution's preamble, We the People, which for many at the time conveyed a sense of collective, almost divine purpose. And of course, the First Amendment's Free Exercise Clause.
All those reflect this. It strongly suggests a moral framework for the new nation that was deeply informed by and often explicitly rooted in Christian principles.
But this is where the nuanced critiques come in, right?
Exactly. Some scholars argue the founders were primarily Enlightenment thinkers promoting secularism. They often point to Jefferson's personal deistic views, which were somewhat unorthodox.
Right, the watchmaker God idea.
Kind of. Or they point to the Constitution's Establishment Clause. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion as evidence for a desire for a strictly secular state.
Separation of church and state?
Well, that phrase comes later from a Jefferson letter, but the principle is debated there. However, it's essential to acknowledge that regardless of individual theological stances, the founders did employ religious language. They invoked God in public discourse. Well, whether it was a genuine reflection of their deepest beliefs, or perhaps a strategic move to legitimize their ideals and revolution, or simply a powerful way to unite the religiously diverse colonies, that interplay undeniably shaped the emerging American identity.
Right.
It laid a complex foundation for the ongoing debates we still have today about religion in public life.
And this relationship between Christianity and natural rights is still profoundly relevant today, isn't it? I mean, debates about religious freedom, the role of government in moral life, the very nature of rights, they're everywhere.
They are. Understanding this historical context provides a crucial and, I think, nuanced perspective on contemporary discourse.
Yeah.
It encourages us to look beyond maybe simplistic interpretations and consider how these foundational beliefs, or the debates around them, continue to shape conversations about civil rights, justice, and individual freedoms in our increasingly pluralistic society. It's truly a living legacy.
Okay, moving on to the actual documents themselves. The Declaration of Independence, arguably the most significant public document of the founding, drafted primarily by Thomas Jefferson in 1776. It was much more than just a breakup letter with Britain.
Oh, far, far more. It was a bold philosophical manifesto, a declaration of intent rooted in these fundamental principles we've been discussing. It encapsulated the colony's profound desire for autonomy, for self-governance, providing a clear rationale for independence based explicitly on natural rights and the social contract.
And by asserting all men are created equal and endowed with unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
It truly reflected a foundational consensus, at least among the leadership, on individual rights and Republican ideals, setting a high moral standard for the new nation, even if reality fell short.
And its symbolic power was just immense, wasn't it?
Huge. It didn't just state a position. It served as a powerful rallying point against British rule. It united diverse groups under the banner of independence and really ignited the revolutionary spirit. It was a profound symbol of American unity and resolve.
Okay, but let's dive into those divine references within the Declaration, because they are often discussed and debated. What do terms like nature's God, creator, divine providence, and supreme judge of the world actually signify in that context?
Okay, each phrase carries layers of meaning. Nature's God appears right in the first paragraph. It signifies a belief in a universal governing force, the source of that natural law we talked about, that governs human behavior.
And deist?
It can be interpreted that way. It's somewhat neutral, a universal creator of these natural laws. It implies a connection with the natural world and, importantly, the freedom to pursue rights without infringing on others.
Okay. And creator?
Creator suggests inherent, undeniable rights, not granted by any earthly monarch. This imbues the fight for freedom with a moral imperative and profoundly highlights the inherent dignity of each individual. This concept served as a fundamental foundation for all men are created equal, directly influencing later civil rights movements by establishing an ideal against which to measure societal progress.
So it frames the revolution not just as a political fight, but also as a moral and even spiritual one with a higher purpose.
Precisely. Then you have divine providence. This reflects the widespread belief at the time that God actively oversees human affairs, guiding and supporting the revolutionary mission.
Yeah.
It resonated deeply with the religious populace, many of whom genuinely saw the revolution as fulfilling a kind of divine purpose.
And supreme judge of the world.
That underscores the belief that ultimate authority, ultimate justice, lies with God. This implies that human judges and governments are fallible, and that their laws must ultimately align with a higher moral standard. This concept continues to influence contemporary debates on human rights, medical ethics, even environmental stewardship, grounding our legal systems, at least historically, in a sense of moral accountability.
But isn't there an ongoing, pretty fierce debate about the role of religion in public life and governance? especially with the idea of separation of church and state being so central to modern American thought.
There absolutely is. And while the separation of church and state, as a phrase, is often inferred from Jefferson's later writings and the First Amendment's Establishment Clause, the Declaration's language does suggest a deep intertwining of divine authority and human governance at the founding.
Yeah, it's right there.
It's right there. These references continue to spark robust debate, especially as society becomes more pluralistic and diverse. However, understanding their original context can maybe encourage constructive dialogue and cooperation by emphasizing what were, at least for many, shared moral foundations, potentially bridging divides in an era of polarization.
Okay. Before we got to the Constitution, there were these critical early attempts at union. The state constitutions drafted during and after the Revolutionary War, like the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780, were pretty significant themselves, weren't they? They weren't just stepping stones, they were active experiments in self-governance.
They absolutely were vital laboratories of democracy. These state constitutions reflected local values, they delineated specific government structures, and articulated citizens' rights, often including explicit declarations of civil liberties. The Massachusetts Constitution of 1780, for example, was particularly lauded for its robust Republican principles and its clear separation of powers. It became a model.
Right.
They allowed Americans in different states to express specific grievances and aspirations, forming this kind of mosaic of interests that ultimately contributed to a cohesive national identity and provided really valuable lessons for the later federal system.
And then we had the Articles of Confederation in 1781, the first formal attempt at a unified government after independence. It seems like it pretty quickly revealed its limitations.
It certainly did. While it fostered maybe a nascent sense of unity and cooperation among the newly independent states, the Articles deliberately created a weak central government.
By design.
By design. It lacked critical powers, like the ability to levy taxes effectively or regulate interstate commerce. This led to serious issues: crippling interstate trade disputes, an inability to raise a unified military force for defense, just a general lack of cohesion.
It's kind of chaos.
Heading towards it. Its ultimate failure led to a broad consensus that a more effective and robust governing framework was desperately needed, which directly paved the way for the Constitutional Convention of 1787.
Which brings us finally to the U.S. Constitution, ratified in 1788, and then the Bill of Rights in 1791. This wasn't a sudden flash of brilliance, was it? Our source emphasizes it was a true, hard-won, negotiated consensus, born from those intense debates between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists.
It was a truly remarkable feat of negotiation, compromise, and frankly, foresight. The Federalist Papers, penned mostly by Hamilton, Madison, and Jay, were instrumental. These essays didn't just advocate for a stronger federal government. They eloquently articulated the rationale for the proposed system, systematically addressing opponents' concerns about centralized power, about potential tyranny.
Right, they were trying to sell it.
They were. The framers meticulously balanced the need for a powerful central government capable of effective action with explicit protections for individual liberties, leading directly to the demand for, and addition of, the Bill of Rights, which enumerated citizens' fundamental rights.
Okay.
This whole process reflects a profound collective commitment, after much argument, to both a functional constitutional republic and the preservation of individual freedoms.
And the public sentiment behind all of this was crucial, fueled by those Enlightenment ideals of reason, progress, social contracts. It wasn't just abstract philosophy locked away in libraries. It truly galvanized the populace, promoting a shared understanding of the ideals that would define the nation's future.
Exactly. Pamphlets, essays, newspaper articles circulated widely, sparking passionate public debate and engagement. It's a very literate society, at least among certain classes.
Yeah.
This period reflected a dynamic society willing to confront profound issues and strive for improvement, however imperfectly. These foundational documents, and the spirit behind them, continue to be profoundly relevant today. They aren't just historical artifacts, they provide essential context for understanding contemporary governance, justice, civil rights.
And movements today still use them.
Indeed. Movements advocating for civil rights and social justice still draw deeply upon these same Enlightenment ideals, using them as their moral and legal touchstones to demand change.
So these foundational texts aren't just history lessons, but living documents that shape ongoing debates about constitutional interpretations, civil liberties, and that delicate balance of power between different branches and levels of government.
Absolutely. They continue to prompt reflection and discussion on how best to live up to the soaring ideals they proclaim, even as society evolves and presents entirely new challenges the founders couldn't have imagined.
Okay, now let's turn to one of the most glaring and, frankly, painful historical contradictions of the founding, the paradox of slavery.
Unavoidable.
The Declaration proclaimed all men are created equal, yet the institution of slavery was deeply entrenched and legally sanctioned. This was a profound fundamental violation of natural liberty, wasn't it?
It was the ultimate denial of inherent human rights, life, liberty, property, by treating human beings as mere chattel, as property.
Right.
While the founders articulated a grand vision of universal equality, their application of that principle was, tragically, not universal, most notably in their own practices and the legal allowance of slavery.
But did the contradiction itself create a problem for them?
Well, the inherent tension within the principles they espoused did provide a powerful moral framework for subsequent generations to relentlessly critique the institution itself and ultimately work towards its abolition. The words were there, even if the actions weren't.
And slavery was deeply woven into the fabric of the early U.S. economy, wasn't it? Especially in the southern states, driven primarily by lucrative crops like cotton.
Absolutely. But growing moral opposition, particularly in the North, led to the passionate abolitionist movement in the 19th century. You had powerful figures like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, William Lloyd Garrison emerging as incredibly vocal critics.
Their narratives must have been powerful.
Incredibly powerful, especially those of formerly enslaved individuals like Douglass. They humanized the enslaved population and garnered immense public support for the cause of freedom. The Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 were truly pivotal moments, followed swiftly by the 13th Amendment in 1865, which formally abolished slavery throughout the nation.
Monumental steps.
Monumental steps, absolutely. Yet, as history clearly shows, full natural liberty remained elusive for generations. Systemic racism persisted through insidious black codes, then Jim Crow laws during Reconstruction and well beyond.
What about the founders' own dilemma regarding slavery? I mean, they articulated these aspirations for liberty and equal rights, but simultaneously exhibited profound apprehension about the consequences of immediate liberation. What was going on there?
It's a really complex historical knot. Our source indicates a widespread fear among many founders, and perhaps the broader white populace, of violent retribution from freed slaves.
Fear.
Fear, yes, coupled with a perceived lack or maybe unwillingness to create established mechanisms for their safe and equitable reintegration into society. These fears, combined with entrenched economic interests and, let's be frank, deep-seated racial prejudices, contributed to a reluctance, a failure to abolish slavery during the nation's formative years.
So they were caught.
They were caught in a profound dilemma. Their stated commitment to liberty was complex and often deeply conflicted due to self-interest, prejudice, and this apprehension of catastrophic societal upheaval.
And this led to intense debates about the capacity for citizenship among ex-slaves, didn't it?
It did. Proponents of slavery argued that the conditions of servitude themselves indicated a lack of moral development or intelligence, making enslaved people inherently unfit for citizenship. This argument, of course, was rooted in those deeply entrenched racial prejudices.
How did abolitionists counter that?
Abolitionists powerfully countered this by pointing to the incredible resilience, intelligence, and agency of ex-slaves. They cited figures like Frederick Douglass, whose life narrative as a brilliant orator, writer, and civil rights advocate absolutely demolished prevailing stereotypes.
Yeah, hard to argue with his example.
Exactly. They argued vehemently that citizenship should be based on demonstrated abilities, character, adherence to Republican ideals, not on race or prior status of servitude. For moral reformers like William Lloyd Garrison and Sojourner Truth, emancipation wasn't just a legal matter, but an urgent moral imperative for the nation's entire moral fabric to align with its stated ideals.
And despite the immense challenges, there was a prevailing belief in moral progress, wasn't there? An optimistic view, maybe naive sometimes, that society, however slowly, was on a trajectory toward greater justice.
Yes, I think that belief was there. The passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments during Reconstruction formally acknowledged, on paper at least, the rights of formerly enslaved individuals, expanding the promise of the Declaration. And cultural contributions, like Harriet Beecher Stowe's monumental novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, significantly shaped public opinion, depicting the horrors of slavery and the inherent dignity of its victims. It powerfully demonstrated that moral progress, though often agonizingly slow and facing backlash, was achievable.
So the legacy of slavery is still very much with us today. Ongoing discussions about systemic racism, socioeconomic disparities, even debates about reparations.
Absolutely.
Civil rights movements continue to echo those natural rights philosophies, using the founders' own words, ironically sometimes, to hold the nation accountable to its promises.
Absolutely. It demands critical reflections on our legal and moral frameworks and urges society to remain vigilant against any practices that undermine human dignity and freedom. The paradox continues to challenge us, generation after generation, to live up to our highest ideals.
Okay, moving on to equality and inequality. Our source makes an interesting point. It argues that while human beings are inherently unequal in terms of talents, intelligence, virtues, social standings, obvious disparities exist. These natural inequalities do not grant anyone the right to rule over others without their consent.
This is a crucial philosophical distinction. It fundamentally underpins democratic thought. John Locke's social contract theory directly refutes the idea that any superiority of abilities, whether intellectual or physical, justifies imposing authority without consent.
Right.
And Rousseau's view that individuals are born free and possess equal rights means any governance overriding individual assent is fundamentally flawed and illegitimate.
So even if someone is demonstrably smarter or more talented or stronger, they don't automatically get to dictate to others. This has huge implications for societal structures, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. Non-consensual rule, think authoritarian regimes, hereditary monarchies, inherently undermines democratic accountability and the dignity of the individual. Hannah Arendt, a profound political theorist, argued that power derived without consent ultimately leads to alienation and oppression. The Enlightenment spurred this dramatic shift towards more egalitarian structures, with the American Declaration asserting that legitimate governments derive just powers from the consent of the governed.
And the counterexamples are grim.
Terribly grim. The tragic 20th century totalitarian regimes of Stalin and Hitler starkly illustrate the perils and immense human cost of authority maintained without genuine public assent, leading to widespread suffering and the complete suppression of individual rights.
So in contemporary society, consent and equality are foundational principles underpinning democratic governance, whether through civic engagement or the fundamental right to vote. But technology seems to have this dual impact again, both empowering and challenging.
It's definitely a double-edged sword. Technology can bolster engagement, offering new platforms for dialogue and mobilization via social media. Think of how quickly movements can gain traction now.
Yeah, hashtag activism.
Right, but it also poses significant threats through the rapid spread of misinformation, the creation of polarizing echo chambers, and profound social division. Navigating these complexities requires constant vigilance and active participation to uphold democratic principles that are firmly anchored in consent.
Okay, and what about natural equality itself? Our source says all individuals possess intrinsic worth and equal rights, but then it mentions this moral and developmental continuum that justifies different degrees of authority, like parental authority over children. How do we reconcile those two ideas?
This is a key nuance that the founders themselves grappled with. While children possess equal inherent rights, they are not yet fully capable of reasoning or understanding the long-term consequences of their actions in the same way an adult is expected to.
Okay.
This is precisely why legal frameworks around the world don't grant full legal rights to minors until a specified age, typically 18 in many places. It reflects a pragmatic application of natural equality, equal in inherent worth, but not yet equal in the capacity for fully independent rational judgment.
So reason is key here.
Reason, as an intellectual capacity, plays a pivotal role in moral decision-making. The founders generally believed rational thought set humanity apart, entitling those who possess it to freedoms because they can, in theory, be held accountable for their choices.
So, what about those whose reasoning capacities are impaired? The source mentions historical categorizations like madmen, which is a term that carries some really loaded historical baggage.
Indeed it does. Historically, madness was often conflated with moral depravity or even seen as divine punishment. Today, thankfully, our understanding has evolved dramatically. We emphasize mental health and the fundamental rights of all individuals, regardless of cognitive ability.
Right.
Societal obligation now balances protection of the vulnerable with empathy, dignity, and rehabilitation, ideally. Laws and social policies are designed to safeguard vulnerable populations, highlighting both individual rights and our collective responsibility.
Okay.
So the interplay between natural equality and the capacity for reason has these profound implications for social governance and individual autonomy. It demands a pragmatic and compassionate approach for both things like parental authority and protecting society from those genuinely lacking rational thought in a way that poses danger.
Okay, now we come to rights and consent in practice and evolution, starting with the crucial distinction between natural rights and legal rights. Can you break that down for us a bit more clearly?
Certainly. So natural rights, as we've said, are inherent, often described as God-given, or derived simply from human nature itself. They exist independently of any legal system. Think of your right to breathe, your right to think your own thoughts. It's just part of being human. No government grants it to you.
Okay, pre-existing.
Pre-existing. They affirm the intrinsic dignity of the individual regardless of legal frameworks. Legal rights, on the other hand, sometimes called positive or social rights, are, by contrast, codified by laws and policies. They are therefore contingent on state provision.
Like what?
The right to public education, for example, or the right to vote at a certain age, these are legal rights established through legislative frameworks. They don't just exist in nature.
So a fundamental transformation. Natural rights are pre-existing entitlements, while legal rights necessitate institutional recognition and support from the government or society.
Exactly. And this distinction sparks ongoing debate. Critics argue that prioritizing positive rights that require the government to provide something can risk infringing on individual liberties and economic freedoms, which are often seen as negative rights, meaning freedom from interference.
How so?
For example, government interventions to guarantee universal health care or housing rights could potentially impact property rights or economic freedom through taxation or regulation.
Right.
This directly raises the question of whose consent is truly necessary for the resource redistribution needed to fulfill positive rights. Is it an explicit agreement made by everyone, or is it somehow implicit in the social contract that we all tacitly agree to just by living within a society?
That's a deep question. Whose consent is needed for that kind of redistribution? And it implies a necessary interdependence rather than pure individualism, right, if we're going to have positive rights.
Yes, precisely. A nuanced understanding of consent has to encompass not just individual rights, but also collective interests and obligations. It subtly shifts the dialogue from pure individualism towards a recognition of interdependence within a community. The future of rights discourse really hinges on this ongoing dialogue and the active role of an informed citizenry, holding governments accountable for respecting both categories of rights, freedom from and entitlement to.
Okay, and the foundational role of consent itself is crucial here. What exactly is it, beyond just, agreeing to something? What makes it valid?
At its core, consent is about the fundamental autonomy of individuals to make decisions regarding their own bodies, their own choices, their own freedoms. It's an agreement rooted in knowledge and voluntary acceptance of terms, not coercion or deception.
Knowledge and voluntary acceptance. Okay.
This principle is a cornerstone for personal autonomy, privacy, and bodily integrity. Its philosophical roots are deep in those social contract theories, where individuals willingly relinquish some freedoms to the state in exchange for protection and societal benefits. We see this evolution profoundly in socio-legal developments, like the Nuremberg Code of 1947.
After the Nazi experiment.
Exactly, which stipulated voluntary informed consent as an absolute, non-negotiable requirement for any medical experiments on human subjects.
So it's about true, informed, voluntary agreement. And this leads us directly to civil rights and consent with their historical and modern challenges. How did the founders understand civil rights initially? Was it the same as our modern understanding?
They viewed civil rights primarily as legal protections, ensuring individuals could enjoy their natural rights within a political community. Drawing heavily from Locke and Rousseau, civil rights emerged as practical safeguards for individuals entering the social contract, ensuring they wouldn't be subjected to arbitrary oppression without their consent. The Bill of Rights in 1791 exemplifies this perfectly, enumerating explicit protections against government overreach, freedom of speech, religion, assembly, and so on.
And consent is pivotal here, legitimizing governmental authority. But it's not unconditional, is it? It rests on the government actually protecting those natural rights it's supposed to.
Right. It's a two-way street. Voting is an explicit, active form of consent to be governed by the winners, at least for a time. Tacit consent, however, is often assumed through civic engagement and general compliance with laws.
Just by living here and following the rules.
Kind of. However, significant challenges arise when governmental policies infringe upon fundamental rights without adequate public discourse or explicit consent. The civil rights movement of the 1960s is the prime example, powerfully challenging systemic racism and disenfranchisement that contradicted the very ideals of consent and equality the nation claimed to uphold.
Criminal justice reform also intersects here, doesn't it? Debates on decriminalizing things like marijuana, for instance, raise fascinating questions about the limits of state control versus personal freedoms and individual consent.
Indeed. As states across the country reconsider their legal frameworks for drug offenses, consent becomes central to discussions about individual rights versus state regulation and the broader societal costs of prohibition. Who gets to decide what you can consume?
Right.
And the digital age adds entirely new layers of complexity. Surveillance technologies, data privacy, the ubiquitous collection of personal data by corporations and governments all call into question the ability of individuals to meaningfully consent to the use of their information.
Yeah, those terms and conditions nobody reads.
Exactly. The Cambridge Analytica scandal, for example, starkly highlighted the potential for exploitation without truly informed consent, necessitating stronger protections and clearer ethical guidelines.
So, civil rights, then, are distinct from natural rights in that they are shaped by legal frameworks after independence, granted within social contracts, and, importantly, can reflect the values and even the biases of those in power at the time they're created or interpreted.
Precisely. The U.S. Constitution itself, despite its Republican ideals, exhibited this pattern of exclusion, most notably with the deeply problematic Three-Fifths Compromise. It paradoxically purported to protect rights for some while denying basic humanity and citizenship to others based on race. This fundamental contradiction led to a prolonged and arduous struggle for civil rights.
Generations of struggle.
Generations, with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments marking monumental progress on paper, followed by generations of legal battles, the horrors of Jim Crow laws, and then landmark legislation like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
And even recently, the COVID-19 pandemic introduced new and challenging discussions about consent regarding things like vaccination and mask mandates, forcing us again to balance individual freedoms against collective responsibility.
This reflects the constantly evolving nature of consent in a dynamic society. Civil rights are also defined by societal norms and collective values, not just rigid legal frameworks. The U.S. Civil Rights Movement was driven by a powerful collective demand for justice.
Right.
And contemporary indigenous rights movements, citing things like the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP, powerfully illustrate how community, consent, and self-determination shape the very understanding and application of civil rights on a global scale.
Okay. This leads us neatly into duties, responsibilities, and virtue in a republic. What's the fundamental relationship between rights and obedience? Because it's not just about what you're owed, but what you owe as a citizen, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's a reciprocal relationship. So natural rights are inherently human, universal, exist independently. They form a moral foundation for laws and cannot be legitimately surrendered. Political rights, on the other hand, arise from membership in a specific political community and are contingent on laws like the right to vote or hold office. They explicitly imply consent to the rules of that community.
Okay, what's the key distinction then?
The distinction is crucial. Natural rights provide the unshakable moral underpinning, while political rights offer the concrete mechanism for citizens to express consent and influence their government.
So there's an interplay where individuals conditionally relinquish certain aspects of their maybe natural freedoms in exchange for the benefits of political rights, like security, representation, the collective good provided by the state.
Exactly. This dynamic is profoundly exemplified in civil rights movements. Demands for political rights, like the right to vote, are deeply rooted in asserting violations of natural rights.
How so?
Activists throughout history argued that systemic injustices violated their natural rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, emphasizing the necessity of aligning political rights with inherent human dignity. This points to a reciprocal allegiance. Rights necessitate obedience to the laws that protect those rights for everyone, and citizen participation becomes a collaborative effort to maintain that social contract.
Which brings us to a critical, albeit often debated, element in political philosophy: the right to revolution. This applies when consent is fundamentally breached. But it's not a right to rebellion for every little grievance, is it? That would be chaos.
No, absolutely not. It's presented as a rigorous and grave standard. Rooted deeply in John Locke's social contract theory, the right to rise against a tyrannical or unjust government is justified only when that government fundamentally and systematically fails to protect natural rights or actively becomes destructive to them.
Okay, a high threshold.
A very high threshold. It's a matter of profound moral and political accountability, a reclaiming of rights when a reciprocal relationship between the governed and the governing is irrevocably broken.
So, not for mere unpopularity or political disagreement, but for systemic, pervasive infringement of fundamental rights. The U.S. civil rights movement of the 1960s could be seen as a powerful, modern example, challenging institutionalized segregation as fundamentally at odds with justice and equality, to the point where the existing system itself was argued to be illegitimate in those aspects.
Their efforts were rooted in the profound belief that existing laws and practices directly contradicted the core principles espoused in the Declaration and, implicitly, the Constitution. And crucially, coupled with the right to challenge the state, is the fundamental duty to engage responsibly in civic discourse, to differentiate legitimate, principled dissent from mere lawlessness or anarchy.
Right, it's not a free-for-all.
Not at all. The obligation to obey laws consistent with the social compact underscores the inherent reciprocity of citizenship.
Right.
Rights and responsibilities are always intertwined.
In contemporary society, issues like extreme political polarization, ongoing debates about voter suppression, the ever-present threat of infringements on freedom of speech, they highlight the ongoing tension between rights and obedience. It seems consent isn't a one-time thing you give at the start.
Indeed. Consent isn't static. It's dynamic and evolves over time. If governmental actions are perceived as consistently contrary to the collective good or systematically undermine fundamental liberties, that consent may wane. This can potentially trigger intense debates on the legitimacy of authority and even the necessity of revolution, at least as a philosophical or historical sense, thinking about when it becomes justified. This dynamic interplay reveals the critical balance between adherence to laws and the moral imperative to challenge unjust authority.
So, rights and duties are deeply interconnected. The founders, influenced by Locke and Rousseau, believed that asserting rights comes with an explicit expectation of corresponding moral and civic responsibilities. It's not a free lunch.
This balance is the very crux of a functioning, self-governing society. Consent isn't passive agreement to simply be ruled. It's active engagement in the democratic process, voting, participating in civic discourse, actively contributing to the common good.
And neglecting those duties.
Neglecting those duties, in the founders' view, renders rights theoretical, reducing them to mere words on paper. The civil rights movement powerfully exemplified proactive engagement through nonviolent protests and civil disobedience, demonstrating how active civic duty can transform society when rights are denied.
And today, debates about freedom of speech on digital platforms raise complex questions about responsibilities regarding misinformation, hate speech, online harassment.
Absolutely. The COVID-19 pandemic also starkly highlighted the tension between individual rights, like bodily autonomy, and collective duties, like protecting public health through vaccine mandates or mask wearing.
It forces uncomfortable choices.
It does. These contemporary events underscore the urgent need to revisit and redefine rights and duties in modern governance. Education in particular is paramount for future generations to navigate this complexity, fostering empathy, critical thinking, and informed decision-making. And those essential civic duties like voting, serving on juries, paying taxes, potentially military service, they remain absolutely vital for the health and continued functioning of any democracy.
Okay, let's transition now to the government's multifaceted role, both domestically and internationally, especially in protecting rights. Our source mentions protection from fellow citizens and defense against foreign threats as two key pillars.
Indeed. Government's primary internal role, as the founders envisioned it, is to protect citizens from, as Jefferson put it, wicked and dissolute individuals through criminal law.
Okay.
This includes ensuring fair treatment with the presumption of innocence and the right to legal counsel, but also using laws, like hate crime legislation, to address specific moral failings and protect vulnerable groups.
And the external role?
On the foreign policy front, defense against external threats is a paramount purpose, deeply shaped by the founders' direct Revolutionary War experience. National defense remains a key component of foreign policy, as seen in post-9/11 responses like the global war on terror and ongoing efforts to address sophisticated cyber threats or counter-authoritarian regimes around the world.
And the Constitution itself imposes critical constraints on governmental power, doesn't it? It's not supposed to be unlimited in protecting us.
Absolutely not. The Constitution is the supreme law of the land, designed specifically to impose restraints and ensure no branch operates beyond its defined authority through that brilliant system of separation of powers and checks and balances.
Hmm.
The Bill of Rights guarantees fundamental freedoms and explicitly empowers citizens to challenge state actions, as the landmark case of Marbury v. Madison established early on with judicial review. And its inherent adaptability through mechanisms for amendments reflects evolving societal values, showing it as a living framework while retaining its core principles.
Okay, moving to domestic policy. The founders established a federal system allowing states considerable power. Why was that so important to them? Why not just have one strong central government?
It was largely a recognition of the nation's immense size and diversity even then. It acknowledged varied regional interests and needs. It essentially allowed states to serve as laboratories for democracy, where different approaches to governance could be experimented with.
Right.
Historical circumstances, like the nascent nation's diversity and initially limited federal capacity, solidified states' significant roles in domestic policy. Thus, issues like family law, business regulations, crime control largely fall under state authority, not federal.
And there's significant variation across states as a result, right? For instance, in family law, marriage, divorce, custody, adoption laws are crafted at the state level, leading to a real patchwork across the country.
Exactly. The legal age of marriage grounds for divorce vary widely. Some states like California have community property laws for divorce settlements, while others operate under common law principles. Even the recent national recognition of same-sex marriage, while federally mandated by the Supreme Court, still relies on state-level implementation for many details, further emphasizing the evolving nature of family law at the state level.
And business practices, too.
Similarly, states shape business practices through varied taxation, licensing requirements, operational standards. Delaware, for example, is renowned for its favorable corporate legal frameworks that attract businesses from all over.
And labor policies, too, like minimum wage laws, often differ dramatically from the federal standard. States can set their own higher wage.
Yes. Some states, and even individual cities, have minimum wages significantly higher than the federal minimum, reflecting differing political ideologies and local economic conditions. Crime regulation also varies widely, with states defining offenses and establishing penalties. Think about marijuana. Colorado's early legalization of recreational marijuana showcased a progressive state approach, while other states maintained strict prohibition.
Right.
Criminal justice reform efforts in states like California and New York focus on reducing incarceration rates and addressing systemic inequalities, highlighting differing state priorities and philosophies.
The COVID-19 pandemic really highlighted the importance of state-level governance, didn't it? With that patchwork of public health policies on masks, closures, etc., across the country.
Indeed, emphasizing how state governance directly impacts daily lives in profound ways. Future trends likely include increasing polarization of state policies on contentious issues like healthcare access, education standards, environmental protection, and of course, the profound impact of Supreme Court decisions on states' authority, as seen in recent rulings on abortion rights and voting legislation, which often throw things back at the states.
Okay, now shifting to foreign policy. The founders' vision seems deeply rooted in self-determination and national autonomy, rejecting external interference. I mean, they had just fought a war precisely for that, after all.
Absolutely. Influenced by their direct, painful experience with British colonial rule, figures like Jefferson, Madison, Washington established the precedent that each nation should govern itself without external pressure. The Declaration of Independence fundamentally rejected foreign powers dictating internal affairs. The Federalist Papers, particularly John Jay's Federalist No. 2, emphasized the profound dangers of foreign influence eroding national self-determination and unity. They were very wary of it.
And the concept of self-determination itself is critical globally even today, isn't it?
It is, and it's enshrined, at least in principle, in the UN Charter. It refers to the right of a group or nation to make its own political, economic, social, and cultural decisions free from external pressure. It embodies cultural identity and social unity, implying that no external body has the right to justify altering a nation's internal developments, even under the guise of humanitarian intervention or promoting democracy. That's the ideal anyway.
But history shows glaring inconsistencies with that ideal, doesn't it? Major powers, including the U.S., often disregarded self-determination when it suited them, like during the Cold War interventions.
Yes, the U.S. intervention in Chile in 1973, for example, is a stark reminder of how powerful nations have, at times, overlooked this principle in pursuit of their own strategic or economic interests. This principle remains highly relevant today, with nations grappling with the legacy of colonialism and ongoing struggles for autonomy, as seen in conflicts in regions like the Middle East where external military interventions persist and complicate things immensely.
The founders' foreign policy approach also famously oscillated between engagement and isolationism, right? It wasn't a single fixed view.
It was a dynamic tension from the very beginning. Washington's farewell address, for example, famously warned against entangling alliances, advocating for pragmatism and independence in foreign affairs.
Right.
Jefferson, in contrast, tended to emphasize commerce as a path to peaceful international relations. Hamilton and the Federalists, however, generally advocated for a more robust military readiness and active global engagement to project American power and influence. This inherent tension between engagement and isolationism profoundly set the framework for future U.S. foreign policy debates that continue to this day.
And that framework evolved significantly over time. Isolationism wasn't permanent.
No. The 19th century largely saw predominant isolationism, but it was punctuated by moments of significant engagement, like the Louisiana Purchase, which doubled the country's size, and the Bold-Monroe Doctrine in 1823, which asserted American dominance in the Western Hemisphere against further European colonization. Manifest Destiny then justified continental expansion, further fracturing the isolationist ethos. The 20th century, with 2 world wars, marked a significant departure, leading to unprecedented commitment to international allies, the formation of the UN, and alliances like NATO during the Cold War.
And today?
Today, U.S. foreign policy reflects a deeply integrated approach, addressing complex global challenges like trade negotiations, military interventions, climate change, terrorism, showing a far more interconnected, engaged stance than Washington might have envisioned, though the debate about the level of engagement continues.
Okay, finally, within this section, let's talk about prioritizing citizens, particularly regarding immigration and national interest. The founders clearly believed government should prioritize its own citizens. That seems fundamental to the social compact idea.
It is fundamental. A government's primary duty in that framework is to the people who formed it and consented to it. Historically, U.S. immigration laws, like the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952, have explicitly prioritized citizens' rights and privileges over those of non-citizens in various ways. Contemporary debates around immigration, national security, and human rights continue to illustrate this governmental inclination, with laws like the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act of 1996, or temporary travel bans during times like the COVID-19 pandemic, reflecting this prioritization, often controversially.
The global refugee crisis really highlights the tension between the moral imperative many feel to assist those fleeing persecution and the legal obligations governments feel towards their own citizens.
Exactly. Countries like Hungary and Poland, for example, have faced criticism for restrictive asylum policies that explicitly prioritize their own citizens, illustrating this stark tension between humanitarianism and national sovereignty. Legally, courts typically emphasize citizens' rights. The Supreme Court case Poumanian v. Bush, for instance, dealt with limiting habeas corpus rights for non-citizen Guantanamo detainees. Citizenship laws themselves explicitly act as a gatekeeping function, limiting rights and benefits for foreigners. And the rise of nationalism globally further reinforces this sometimes stringent prioritization of citizens' rights above all else.
What about the founders' expectations for immigrants themselves? Did they just want an open door, or did they have specific requirements in mind for those who chose to come?
They largely emphasized self-sufficiency. They wanted immigrants who could contribute to the new nation and minimize financial strain on the nascent government. This aligned with Republican ideals of individualism, industriousness, civic responsibility virtues. Benjamin Franklin enthusiastically exemplified and encouraged.
Right.
They generally believed self-sufficient immigrants were also better positioned to assimilate into the new society, enhancing the social fabric rather than burdening it. Though, of course, many immigrants face systemic obstacles, making self-sufficiency difficult.
And the political community's consent for citizenship is also vital in this framework, isn't it? It implies that the existing members, the current citizens, have a say over who joins their collective.
Absolutely. A nation, in this view, is a collective entity with a shared understanding of rights and responsibilities. The principle of consent implies that existing members have a legitimate say over who joins their ranks and becomes part of the social contract. It's rooted deeply in social contract theory.
Okay.
Modern policies like point-based immigration systems in places like Australia and Canada, or more selective security and economic criteria used in the U.S., reflect this concern over national security, economic stability, and social integration. It ultimately raises profound ethical questions about balancing inclusivity and exclusivity and reconciling humanitarian obligations like refugee conventions with national sovereignty.
Okay, let's shift now to morality, virtue, and the Republic's character, starting with the founders' deep concern about the moral character of citizens. Why was this so important to them? It seems almost, I don't know, quaint to us today sometimes, but it was fundamental then.
It was absolutely central, not quaint at all to them. They believed a well-functioning republic needed not just strong institutions, checks and balances, elections, courts,
Right.
but even more fundamentally, virtuous citizens. John Adams famously stated, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other."
Wow, that's blunt.
It's incredibly blunt. It powerfully reflects the belief that the survival of Republican governance relies heavily on the ethical standards and civic virtue of its citizenry. Without it, the whole system, they believed, would inevitably collapse into corruption, factionalism, or anarchy.
And education played a crucial role in cultivating this moral character, didn't it? It wasn't just about teaching reading, writing, and arithmetic back then.
Exactly. Thomas Jefferson, for example, vigorously advocated for public education, specifically to instill civic virtue, ensuring an educated and moral citizenry could effectively engage in self-governance. Early American curricula often included lessons on Republican virtues, classical history examples, and moral philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
Today, character education programs in schools, though often secularized, echo this historical emphasis, aiming to foster ethical decision-making and responsible citizenship.
Religion also played a significant, if complex, role in this cultivation of virtue, as we touched on earlier.
Yes. Many founders, like George Washington, viewed religion as a crucial stabilizing force that promoted moral behavior and a sense of duty beyond self-interest. Washington's farewell address explicitly emphasized religion and morality as indispensable supports for national unity and prosperity.
Right.
This perceived intertwining contributed to the belief that a virtuous citizenry, often informed by religious principles, was critical for a constitutional republic, though it also sparks those contemporary debates about the appropriate role of government in promoting moral or religious values.
And the founders were deeply wary of factionalism, especially James Madison in Federalist Number 10. They saw it as a kind of moral degradation stemming from self-interested behavior, where groups prioritize their own narrow interests over the common good.
Their concerns resonate powerfully with modern political polarization. Deeply entrenched partisan divides and the inability to find common ground directly threaten the very spirit of constitutional republicanism, making the founders' emphasis on moral character and unity incredibly relevant for issues of national cohesion and ethical governance today. They also placed immense emphasis on civic responsibility, an engaged citizenry actively participating, voting, debating, contributing to the common good. Alexis de Tocqueville, observing early America a bit later, famously remarked on Americans' unusual level of civic engagement in associations. Today, things like service learning programs try to promote this spirit.
So moral character isn't just a nice to have. It's seen as essential for a functioning republic. This extends directly to public officials, right? What character requirements did the founders envision for them? They held them to a high standard, too.
Civic virtue is paramount, a deep commitment to the common good over personal gain or partisan loyalty. Madison emphasized that a republic relies on its leaders possessing profound moral integrity and a public-spirited nature. Our source contrasts figures like former Illinois Governor Rod Blagojevich, whose scandals clearly exemplified a profound lack of civic virtue and naked self-serving ambition.
Right, trying to sell a Senate seat.
Exactly. Contrasting that with historical figures like, say, Ronald Reagan, who often promoted ideals of public service and a belief in American exceptionalism, projecting a certain image of virtue. Integrity and accountability are, and always have been, crucial for the legitimacy and effectiveness of political institutions. Public trust depends on it.
And criminal law, too, was seen as a way to secure morality, not just punish crime. Jefferson believed the law should defend citizens from wicked and dissolute individuals, meaning it had a moral dimension beyond just maintaining order.
Exactly. Criminal laws were designed not just to reflect society's moral standings, but also to actively deter immoral actions like theft, assault, or murder. They also aimed ideally for rehabilitation and restitution, seeking to restore moral balance to the community after a transgression. Laws concerning white-collar crime, such as fraud and embezzlement, exemplify how criminal law addresses moral failings that profoundly impact society's trust and economic fabric. It also safeguards individual rights through mechanisms like the presumption of innocence, the right to legal counsel, and crucially, hate crime legislation that specifically protects marginalized groups from morally reprehensible acts motivated by bias.
And technology again.
Technology, however, introduces new challenges with cybercrime, privacy issues, data protection laws, and the complex moral implications of digital behavior, constantly pushing the boundaries of our existing legal and ethical frameworks.
Okay, beyond laws, what specific virtues did the founders believe were absolutely essential for a flourishing society? The source mentions justice, moderation, and temperance as key.
Yes, justice was foundational, encompassing adherence to laws, fulfilling obligations, and vigorously defending others' rights when they were violated. Locke's social contract theory and the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780 highlighted the importance of fair laws and equitable application.
Right.
Justice for them was deeply intertwined with accountability, as they believed a republic relies entirely on the moral integrity of its citizens. Violations, they warned, would inevitably lead to civic deterioration and distrust.
And moderation and temperance are about avoiding extremes, which seems incredibly relevant for our polarized times today.
Precisely. Moderation means avoiding extremes in thought, behavior, and consumption. It fosters rational deliberation over destructive factionalism and passion. George Washington, in his farewell address, passionately urged the nation to avoid divisive political factions for the preservation of the Union, promoting compromise and unity as essential virtues. Temperance, particularly control of desires and consumption, contributes significantly to social stability. It's a kind of psychological capability to remain composed and disciplined, fostering a civil culture conducive to dialogue and cooperation. Individual moderation, in their view, was intrinsically linked to social responsibility, making it critical for collective stability and prosperity.
The founders also emphasized industry, frugality, and civic virtue more broadly. What did they mean by industry and frugality?
A strong work ethic, meaning industry, diligence, responsibility, was seen as leading directly to productivity, fostering trust within the community, encouraging personal development, and building societal resilience. This was crucial then, and it's arguably still crucial now in a competitive globalized market. Frugality meant the economical, cautious, and sensible use of financial assets. It prioritizes value and sustainability over wasteful consumption.
Okay.
It fosters financial security for individuals and families and resourcefulness for the community. Both contribute significantly to individual and societal resilience. The founders believed these practical virtues were cornerstones of responsible citizenship.
And courage in war, as Hamilton emphasized, was seen as vital for national defense, calling for citizen soldiers willing to fight.
Yes, yet they also recognized its rarity, which sometimes led to structures like the draft during times of national crisis when volunteers weren't enough. Prudence and statesmanship, meaning wisdom, foresight, judiciousness in decision-making, was also considered rare and absolutely indispensable for leaders. James Madison, in Federalist No. 10 and elsewhere, emphasized the need for prudent representatives capable of balancing competing interests and looking towards the long-term good. The founders greatly feared despotism, stemming from a lack of prudence in leadership, designing their system of checks and balances precisely to guard against rash or tyrannical decisions.
Right.
These virtues, industry, frugality, courage, prudence, remain crucial today amid political polarization and rapid technological evolution, constantly challenging us to cultivate them in our leaders and ourselves to preserve democracy.
So how did the founders envision promoting virtue beyond just passing laws and designing institutions? How do you actually make people virtuous?
They understood that virtue needed to be actively cultivated, not just assumed. Public officials were seen as crucial moral exemplars whose conduct and rhetoric profoundly influenced the national moral landscape.
Leading by example.
Leading by example. Figures like Washington and Jefferson utilized public oratory, ceremonies, and their own personal conduct, or at least the public perception of it, to emphasize patriotism, civic responsibility, and moral integrity. Education was also seen as a primary means. Early American education systems were explicitly designed to instill civic values and moral principles from youth, shaping character and preparing students for self-governance.
And religion was part of that education.
Often, yes. This education was frequently deeply steeped in religious teachings, as many believed religion provided the necessary moral framework for virtue.
So it was a kind of synergistic system they envisioned. Criminal justice, public leadership setting an example, education instilling values, and religious instruction reinforcing morality, all working together to foster a virtuous citizenry.
Exactly. The founders had nuanced views on the precise relationship between religion and governance. Jefferson, despite his personal deistic leanings, famously stated he believed national morality depended significantly on religious principle, even if he championed separation of church and state institutionally.
Mm.
The First Amendment, therefore, was seen by many as balancing the protection of religious liberties with the perceived necessity for moral cultivation within society, often fostered by religion.
So how does that translate today, especially regarding religion in schools?
Well, while public schools are largely secular today due to Supreme Court rulings like Engle v. Vitale and Abington School District v. Schempp, the historical context highlights the roots of character education programs, which often integrate moral teachings, sometimes drawing from universal ethical principles found across various religious and philosophical traditions.
Right.
And community values rooted in religion, fostered by churches, synagogues, mosques, and charitable organizations, also continue to shape ethical behavior and societal norms for many people, cultivating accountability and integrity in private life and fortifying communal ties through shared beliefs and practices.
Okay, let's try to tie this all together now, the founding today. How are these foundational principles still relevant? How do they resonate or maybe clash with our modern world?
Well, the commitment to protecting individual rights remains the absolute core of the U.S. government's stated purpose, deeply influenced by thinkers like Locke and Hobbes. The Declaration of Independence, with its assertion of unalienable rights, and the Bill of Rights serve as foundational legal documents guaranteeing personal freedoms. Debates about privacy in the digital age, government surveillance, free speech online, and movements like Black Lives Matter continually invoke these fundamental protections, showing their enduring power and relevance.
And national defense is still seen as a primary purpose of government, just as it was in the Revolutionary era.
Absolutely. The Founders' Revolutionary War experience profoundly shaped this understanding. Post-9/11 initiatives like the Global War on Terror and ongoing efforts to address sophisticated cyber threats or counter-authoritarian regimes globally reflect this continuing focus on national security as a paramount governmental responsibility.
What about the family unit? Was that important to the founders?
The importance of the family unit is also often cited as a foundational principle, seen by many founders as the primary building block for moral and ethical development within society. Stable family systems were thought crucial for raising virtuous citizens. Contemporary discussions about social policies impacting families, healthcare, education, welfare, along with the profound impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, continually highlight the centrality of family in societal well-being, leading to policy initiatives like paid family leave or accessible childcare debates.
But society is constantly evolving, posing new challenges to how these principles are applied. The context changes.
Indeed. Issues like climate change, which requires collective action, rapidly advancing technology, persistent economic inequality. These necessitate a continuous reevaluation of how foundational ideas apply.
For example,
the delicate balance between individual rights and public safety, especially with surveillance and policing technologies, remains a highly contentious area. National defense must adapt to new threats like cyber warfare and unconventional conflict, often requiring nuanced diplomatic engagement alongside military readiness. And evolving social mores, like the rise of diverse family configurations, including single-parent households and same-sex marriages, demand a constantly nuanced understanding of the family unit for policymakers applying those older ideals.
so how does modern morality compare to the founders' ideals? And is there a genuine call to return to these ideals in our time? Is that realistic?
Our source points to a perceived growing disconnect from foundational moral principles in modern society, often characterized by hyper-individualism, the erosion of community bonds, and a pervasive sense of moral relativism, the idea that there are no objective moral truths. The impact of social media, for instance, with its potential for anonymity, cyberbullying, and the commercialization of ethical standards, where profit sometimes seems to trump principle, are cited as significant concerns. This situation, the source argues, necessitates a robust and ongoing dialogue to revisit core values like respect, honesty, and community, actively fostering ethical discussions in educational institutions, families, and public forums.
So returning to ideals isn't just about nostalgia for some imagined golden age, but a pragmatic response to contemporary challenges we face right now.
It's presented precisely that way. It's framed as a call to actively foster integrity through honesty and transparency, especially in rectifying ethical breaches we see in business and politics. It's a call for respect, meaning a profound acknowledgement of others' inherent dignity, trying to bridge deep divides based on political affiliation, socioeconomic status, or other differences. And it's a call for accountability, emphasizing communal responsibility and prioritizing collective well-being over pure self-interest.
Who leads that call?
Public figures, educators, community leaders serve as crucial role models, reinforcing these values through their actions and words. And lessons from historical struggles, like the Civil Rights Movement, show how aligning societal norms with deeply held moral principles can lead to profound and lasting progress.
How did the founders view dignity and compassion? Was it the same as our modern view?
Interestingly, the source suggests the founders' view might have differed slightly. Dignity wasn't always seen as intrinsic for all life in the universal modern sense, but was often tied to virtuous conduct, something earned through actions and intentions, as Jefferson emphasized regarding character and moral integrity.
Earned dignity.
Similarly, compassion was perhaps seen less as mere pity and more as action consistent with high ethical standards fostering self-reliance, for example, not just dependency. Washington and Hamilton, for instance, sometimes cautioned against unbridled compassion that sidestepped moral accountability or prudence.
So, moral education, in its broadest sense, learning ethics, civics, responsibility, is absolutely essential for a republic to instill these virtues and responsibly navigate things like political polarization and demands for ethical leadership.
It is, reflecting the founders' enduring emphasis on the character of the citizenry as the ultimate guarantor of liberty. Without that foundation, they feared the structure couldn't hold.
And finally, let's touch on some specific challenges to founding principles, especially those instances where historical practices seemed to directly contradict the stated ideals. Coverture, for example, the legal doctrine that essentially treated married women as legally subordinate to their husbands, that definitely contradicted the founding ideals of liberty and equality.
It was a profound contradiction. It stripped married women of fundamental rights, property ownership, and an independent legal identity. It reinforced stark hierarchies that directly challenged the spirit of the founding. While now universally rejected, thankfully, with legal reforms like the Married Women's Property Acts in the 19th century and eventually the 19th Amendment granting women suffrage. Coverture highlights the painful limitations of the founders' initial understanding and application of equality. It shows how ideals can take time and struggle to be fully realized.
What about freedom of association? That sounds positive, intended by the founders to bolster liberty and serve as a crucial bulwark against tyranny through voluntary groups. But it faces modern challenges, too.
It is generally positive, but its application can be complex today. Social media echo chambers, for example, can paradoxically foster intolerance and alienation, sort of contradicting the founders' intent for associations to build bridges and civic trust. Legal cases like Masterpiece Cake Shop v. Colorado Civil Rights Commission demonstrate the ongoing tension between freedom of association, in that case for religious reasons, and anti-discrimination laws, forcing a complex balancing of individual rights against broader inclusivity. And Robert Putnam's seminal work, Bowling Alone, highlighted a concerning decline of trust and civic engagement through associations in many modern societies.
So the application of founding principles is a dynamic process, constantly evolving and adapting to new social and technological realities. But local governance still seems to hold on to some enduring values, particularly in smaller towns or certain communities, maybe.
Yes, the source suggests that. Local enforcement of laws and community norms often directly reflects the values of its residents, be it safety, security, or a strong sense of community cohesion. For instance, unlike many nations, America at the federal level doesn't criminalize hate speech, upholding strong First Amendment values of open discussion and dissent, even for deeply unpopular views, trusting the marketplace of ideas more. The right to bear arms, enshrined in the Second Amendment, resonates particularly strongly in many rural and suburban areas as a critical aspect of personal security and autonomy. And the rise of homeschooling reflects, for some, a return to community-oriented education aligning with personal, philosophical, or religious beliefs, offering a distinct alternative to government-sponsored curricula.
So what does this all mean? Taking it all in. It means the debates of the 18th century are very much alive today, influencing our laws, our communities, our technologies, our individual choices. The legacy of the American founding is dynamic, complex, filled with contradictions, but undeniably still shaping us.
And our goal today was really to provide you, the listener, with a powerful shortcut to being well-informed on these complex issues, equipped with some surprising facts maybe, and hopefully a deeper understanding of these foundational principles.
Yeah.
Understanding these historical roots is just crucial for critically navigating contemporary challenges and for seeing the enduring echoes of those early debates in our modern lives, for better or worse.
Indeed. And as you think about everything we've discussed today, from that radical idea of consent based on reason to the enduring call for civic virtue, maybe a final thought to mull over. What does it mean for you to be a virtuous citizen in today's incredibly complex, interconnected world? And how do you balance individual liberty with collective responsibility in an ever-evolving digital and global landscape?
Big questions.
Big questions to ponder. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the political theory of the American founding. We'll see you next time.